Now let's see. Let's take each one of those issues. First, the what's going on in the legislature, if I may. You mentioned that nationally people think that there's incredible reform going on in education. Part of that, I think, is the buzz that Governor Jindal has put out there in terms of the incredible transformation his administration and our legislature has set the course on education. However, as you mentioned, the courts see otherwise, at least in terms of the funding. So right now, that education plan, which has been in effect for 1 year, is under real scrutiny. Are the courts, is the legislature going to be able to fund his program, or what's going to happen? I mean, that sounds like we're having some issues there, despite the fact that we have new money that was found, at least which was the revenue estimating conference had agreed upon. So I'm just wondering, is Jindal's education program going to go anywhere?
Well, I tell you several things. First of all, the court throwing out many of the programs of the governor is not really to blame on some liberal biased court. I could have told you as a lawyer, as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, as a former statewide official, that they got off to a bad start. You can't use public money that is dedicated in the Constitution for vouchers.
Sure.
It wasn't going to go. And so I think that the Jindal folks rushed into what they saw as a vacuum, moved too quickly, and didn't think out the constitutional issues. Now, to the governor's credit, he did try. My daughter, Campbell Brown, that used to be on CNN and the Today Show, she's had lunch with me today, and she said, Dad, I can tell you, there's been a lot of mistakes made and a lot of defeats in Louisiana, but they're not even trying in Mississippi or in Alabama or in a number of states up in New York where she is living. So she said, I got to give credit where credit is due. People like Conrad Appel, the chairman of the Education Committee in the Senate, who's from Jefferson Parish. People like Steve Carter, I mentioned, from Baton Rouge, the House chairman, and the governor, at least are trying. And so they didn't get a lot done, quite frankly, but throughout the country, we've recognized that they've taken an important step with the charter school effort, with vouchers in Louisiana. So I don't want to seem critical. There was a rush to do something too quickly, wasn't quite thought out, but at least we're trying down here. So I look on that as a positive, and eventually I think a lot of these reforms are going to be put in place in Louisiana.
Well, I'm going to play devil's advocate with you, if you don't mind, and you could argue that allowing religion in school in terms of creationism, that's a law that Governor Jindal has approved in terms of allowing the teaching of evolution, of religion rather than evolution. It's trying to change, but is that getting us anywhere?
Well, there's a perception that is a step back. On the other hand, it's one effort in an effort to try a number of experiments in the public schools and the parochial schools. You see, Louisiana is the only state in America that has such a concentration of a three-tier school system. We have a tremendous number of private schools, much more so than most any state in the country. The huge Catholic population, primarily South Louisiana, has created a number of parochial schools. So I guess what I'm saying is, Steve, there has been such a lack of success, and we can talk about this for hours about why there's been a lack of success in educating our kids, that I'm not crazy about allowing creationism, quite frankly, but I think that's a small element in the overall debate of letting schools go various directions and trying to see what works. You know, I ran for governor. Most of your viewers are too young to remember that, back in 1989, 87.
That was the election with Romer and Edwards and Bob Livingston. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead, please.
Probably the most creative, qualified field in the history of the state. Billy Tozan, Congressman Bob Livingston, Congressman Buddy Romer, myself, Governor Edwards, and Governor Governor Romer won that election, but if I had won, I was going to do some things going on right now. Let's try some vouchers in a few parishes. Let's try this. Let's try that. Spread out and see what works. I was up in North Carolina here a few weeks ago, and some of the legislators up there, I know. I went to the University of North Carolina, went back to a reunion, and the president of the North Carolina Senate said, hey, you guys sure are experimenting a whole lot. We ought to be doing that in North Carolina. Well, North Carolina has the reputation of being a pretty solid place for education, yet they're proud of us for experimenting. So sure, you can find some problems when you mention creationism, but you're going to have that teaching in the parochial schools anyway.
That's the parochial school. That's not the public school. And I mean, if you're trying to bring in doctors and scientists and things like that, and you basically you're telling your students here in the state that the Earth was created 5,000 years ago, when science obviously tells you totally different than that. At least in my opinion. I mean, it seems to me if I'm a scientist, a doctor, I'm gonna say, well, wait a minute, is this the state that I want to? Is this state really going to move forward in terms of science and medicine? But I do agree with what you're saying in terms of being a very small issue in terms of the entire educational change being made. From that respect, yeah, I definitely agree.
And when you talk about, first of all, as I understand it, there is the option in a parish to create to teach creationism, number one. Number two, is supposed to be taught as an alternative, as a theory that some people espouse. And I really haven't heard a lot of complaints about parents outraged because this is going on in the schools. I think it's been much slower creeping in. The big issue, let me tell you, you mentioned those doctors and all those folks coming in. Their concern, from what I'm hearing, is not creationism in the schools. It's the cost of the educational system. You're offered a job of $100,000 a year. You come down here thinking you're going to make $100,000, yet you find that if you're not happy with the public system, as an awful lot of people are not, if you go into any number of private schools here, Episcopal, Dunham, and down your way, St. Martin, and all those various schools, they're $15,000, $20,000 a year tuition.
Absolutely.
You got 3 kids, you're making $100,000, and you're paying $60,000 a year to let your kid go to high school or to grade school. So to me, that's the big issue that is scaring a lot of people away from coming down here. They just can't take a competitive job.
Sure.
So it's a crazy mix, but hopefully out of all of the chaos, we're going to see some refreshing springing coming forward. I sure hope so, because the status quo is just completely unacceptable on the local level in teaching, and it would take this right back to the college level. Steve, when I had lunch with my daughter today, and I don't want to brag on Campbell, my daughter, but she is being paid to speak all over the country to educational seminars, and she said, Dad, down there in Louisiana, you can't beat up on the teachers. She said the teachers are only giving back what they've been taught. And not one voice down here is talking about going back to the education departments teaching our teachers. They're being taught today in virtually every college in this state exactly like teachers were 50 years ago. And here's an interesting story to you, Steve. Up in New York after 9/11, they were worried about how the kids would respond. So they had psychologists come in and see if there were some real psychological problems with kids in public schools. The answer was yes, there was. Had nothing to do with 9/11. It was the environment in which they live and teachers' failure to be able to recognize those problems and call in a psychologist. And she said, Dad, the teachers aren't trained like that. So we got to go back to square one with our teaching institutions and teach our teachers better. And all that, I think, is being shaken out. John White, whether you like him or not, our Louisiana Superintendent of Education, comes out of that New York system. Pretty creative guy from what I can tell. And so we've got some fresh faces. We've got some turmoil. We've got some controversy. I just hope that we can do this conversation in about 5 years. We'll say, gosh, it sure has settled down and Louisiana's on the upswing. I sure hope so, Steve.
Now let's talk about the funding. Where's the money going to come from to be able to pay for these charter schools?